Hello everyone, Silent K here, and it's time to look at the last batch of cards for Rise of Bahamut. First up for Bloodcraft, Iceblade Warfiend, 7 mana 5/7. Rush, whenever this follower attacks and destroys an enemy follower, if this follower is not destroyed, draw a card. So for control decks this is a bit sturdier fast option compared to Alucard. On the minus side, Rush and Draw are a little bit slower than Drain and Storm, but you are very likely to draw a card from this. So overall, I will give it a +1. Next, Hungering Horde, 2 mana spell. Choose an enemy follower, deal 3 damage to it and all enemy followers of the same name. So most of the time this is a basic 2 mana deal 3 damage spell. But in some cases you are going to hit multiple enemies with it and it's going to be a decent value. That's not going to happen very often, but it is enough to make this a slightly better control option than Razor Claw. Even if you're just hitting a bunch of 1/1s like fairies or bats or maybe Otohime's bodyguards, it's still going to be like Angelic Barrage for 1 less mana, or sometimes better. Pretty decent card. Overall, +1. Brazen Demoness, 6 mana 3/7. At the end of your turn, gain +2/+0 and deal 2 damage to your leader. It's a pretty decent Evo target, and your opponent is going to have a hard time ignoring it, so you won't have to worry about it sitting on the board dealing repetitive damage to yourself. But it is just a big vanilla follower. So overall, 0. On to Dragoncraft. Pyrozine Dragon, 4 mana 3/4. Fanfare, randomly discard one of the lowest cost cards in your hand 2 times. Last words, draw 3 cards. So if you're playing Discard Dragon with a Dracomancer's Rights on the board, you're going to draw 2 cards as you discard 2, and then draw another 3 cards when this dies. So that is really good value. However, it's probably not worth it for non-discard dragon decks, since you are discarding 2 cards and not getting anything in return right away, and then having this banished or transformed by Runecraft or Havencraft is going to pretty much wreck you, so it's probably not worth the risk. For discard dragon potential though, overall +1. Next, Griffin Knight, 3 mana 2/3. Fanfare, randomly discard one of the lowest cost cards in your hand and deal 2 damage to an enemy follower. So it's a pretty minor effect, which might be okay in Discard Dragon, but not really worth it in non-Discard Dragon decks. You probably aren't going to have a Dracomancer's Rights on the board by the time you play this, but you might discard a Luxfang Kid or something. So, not spectacular, but not terrible either. Overall, 0. Next up, Date Masamune, 2 mana 2/2. Enhance 7, gain +3/+3, Rush and Bane. So just a basic vanilla follower at 2 mana, and a 5/5 Rush and Bane at 7 mana, or a 7/7 Rush and Bane if you choose to evolve it. Rush and Bane can be pretty powerful in the late game, especially if you've run out of evil points. But Dragon does have a lot of powerful late game cards, so I'm not sure the 2 mana or the 7 mana version are going to be better than any of the current options, so it might be a little bit under par. I will give it an overall score of 0. Cunning Wyvern, 5 mana 4/5. Last words, put a Blazing Breath into your hand. Blazing Breath is decent, the stat value is decent. Overall, it's not a terrible card, but it's not really anything special either. Putting a free cheap card in your hand for discard fodder is also a possibility, but nothing really special, so overall 0. On to Forestcraft, Selwyn's Command. 3 mana spell, summon a Skystride Raptor. Enhance 8, then put a Grand Archer Selwyn in your hand, and change its cost to 0. And a Skystride Raptor is a 3 mana 2/1 with Storm. So I don't see the 8 mana enhanced version being relevant to any forest archetype. 3 mana 2 damage Storm minions are pretty useful in aggro decks however, and aggro forest doesn't have access to much Storm aside from Roach, which Roach is very potent, but in an aggro deck you want as much Storm as you can. So aggro forest could run this just for the 3 mana deal 2 damage Storm minion. But other than that, not overwhelming. Overall score of 0. Next, Forest Spirit, 3 mana 3/2. Last words, put a Woodkin Curse in your hand. So Woodkin Curse doesn't really see much play. Every once in a while you see someone put it in their deck, but it's not really in any net decks. You do basically get it for free and you're not really paying much in the way of stats for it, so overall 0. Next, Fairy Knight, 4 mana 3/2, Rush, Fanfare, put a fairy into your hand. This is pretty terrible value, and Forest has plenty of ways to put fairies in their hands, so I don't see this seeing any play. First off, you generally don't want Rush on your 4, 5, or 6 mana followers since you're typically going to evolve them anyway, so if you're paying stats for that effect, then it ends up just being a waste. So this is basically a 3 mana follower that you're paying 4 mana for just to put a fairy into your hand. Overall not worth it, -1. Next, Swords to Woodlands, 3 mana spell, destroy an enemy follower that costs 2 play points or less. Or if 2 other cards were played this turn, destroy an enemy follower that costs 5 play points or less, or destroy an amulet. This is basically a binary and cost restricted version of Elemental Lance, which makes it much worse, and Elemental Lance doesn't even see much play. For 3 mana, Elemental Lance will do 3 damage to any follower, not just affecting followers 2 play points or less, and then if you play 2 cards you can boost that damage to 6, and you can again hit any follower, not just ones that cost 5 play points or less. So overall, pretty bad card, -2. On to Havencraft, Eidolon of Madness, legendary, 5 mana 0/5, unevolved, can't attack or be attacked. At the start of your turn, evolve this follower, and the evolved form is, again a 0/5, can't attack or be attacked. At the end of your turn, destroy all allied amulets. So as long as this is evolved and on the board, it will pop any amulets you play at the end of your turn. So this does have some synergy with cheap high countdown amulets, such as Pegasus, Hair of Illusions, Noble Fangs, Holy Sentinel, Devourer of Heavens, Featherworm's Descent, but it does have anti-synergy with Storm amulets and non-countdown amulets. If you're wondering how this works with Guardian Sun, I would assume it works much the same way Ambush does, in that if you give this ward, your opponent can just ignore it, but I haven't heard confirmation of that, and this is very slow. If you don't evolve it yourself, you have to do nothing for 5 mana and then wait a turn for your amulets to pop, and then wait another turn to use them, which is pretty bad. So overall, -2. The main problem with this is that it has the most synergy with very slow amulets that you don't generally want to play on curve, and regaining that tempo is going to be pretty difficult when your opponent gets the first chance to interact with the followers that come out of your amulets. Ding dong! So not likely to see play. Next up, Manifestation of Faith, 7 mana spell. Randomly put 3 different countdown amulets that cost 2 play points or less from your deck into play. Let me make sure I got that correct. 7 mana spell, randomly put 3 different countdown amulets that cost 2 play points or less from your deck into play. I think Ben Brode was behind this card. This is a terrible card. This is like Purify levels of unplayable. Not only do you do nothing for 7 mana, but you also do nothing for the next 2 or so turns after that while your countdown amulets are still counting down. It is ridiculously slow for 7 mana. The dream scenario for this card would be to play this on turn 7, and then the very next turn play a Skullfane to pop all your amulets immediately. And if you put a bunch of cheap amulets in your deck with big followers in them, then maybe you pop 2 of those and maybe draw a few cards with a Sacred Plea, and you have Skullfane on the board. And yeah, that's a few big minions, but that's nothing you can't already do better with Alana Haven. When the dream scenario is worse than the average scenario of current decks, then you know you have a problem. Overall, -3. This has got to be the worst card in the entire set. Probably the entire game. Next, Soul Collector, 7 mana 4/3, Fanfare, summon a Death Sentence. So on the plus side, Death Sentence is the best lead-in to Seraph. It does control how many followers your opponent can play. If they can't play like 4 followers, then they probably won't play anything at all, which means you have an open board to play Seraph. But putting a 7 mana card in your deck just for that lead-in isn't as flexible as just running Death Sentence by itself. So not likely to see play, but not terrible value. We'll give it an overall score of 0. Onto Runecraft, Dwarf Alchemist, 2 mana 2/2, Fanfare, put an Earth Essence into your hand. Evolve, put a random card with Earth Right from your deck into your hand. So the normal Fanfare version of this card is basically an inverted Elementary Alchemy, without the spell synergy, but it does have benefits in combo enabling when you evolve it. One of the weaknesses of Earthright Rune is that you sometimes have Earthrights, but no Earth Sigils, or you have Earth Sigils and no Earthrights. And as long as you evolve this, you will have both, so. It does only gain +1/+1 when we evolve it though, so overall +1. Timeless Witch, 4 mana 3/4, Fanfare, your leader can't be damaged until this follower leaves the area. The wording is a little weird. Since it's an aura effect, it doesn't need the word fanfare in front of it, but the effect is the same. As long as this is on the board, your opponent can't hit face, which makes it pretty good anti-aggro tech for follower heavy decks. Overall, +1. Blade Mage, 6 mana 2/2, Storm. Subtract 0 from the cost of this card, spell boost, subtract 1 more. So of the tempo spell boost followers like Witchet, Emilu, and Ogler, this is the worst one. You need quite a few reductions before it's worth it. But if you pull it via Daria, it's a 1 mana 2/2 Storm, which is well above average. And in a Daria deck, you can just flush whatever cards you don't need and redraw new cards, so you don't have to worry about holding on to below par cards for very long. Overall, 0. Next, Rite of Exorcism, 3 mana spell, destroy an enemy follower that costs 3 play points or less, enhance 5, destroy an enemy follower or amulet instead. So for 5 mana this is exactly Execute, and it does have a little more flexibility at 3 mana. However, Runecraft decks don't really run Execute since they have a lot of better removal options, so not likely to see play, but not bad value either. Overall, 0. On to Shadowcraft. Zombie Buccaneer, 3 mana 2/2, Necromancy 2, gain last words, summon a zombie. And a zombie is of course a 2/2 as well, so this is possibly better than Skeleton Knight in aggro decks. You gain +3 stats over Skeleton Knight for 2 Necromancy. But in any other deck, it's not really going to be worth it. In aggro decks, the Necromancy cost isn't going to really be a factor, since you don't have a lot of Necromancy cards, usually just Skeleton Fighter, Lesser Mummy, and you need to save a few for the Phantom Howl finisher of course, but it should still be worth it to gain a few stats over Skeleton Knight. Overall, 0. Next, Attendant of the Night, 3 mana 1/1, can only attack the enemy leader and followers with ward. Last words, summon a Lich. This is a Hell's Unleasher for 1 less mana that can't Evo Suicide in Haven and Runecraft matchups, which means it can easily be banished. Even for an aggro deck, you want to do better than a 1/1 for 3 mana. I don't think this will see any play. Overall, -1. On to Swordcraft. Castle in the Sky, 3 mana Amulet. Countdown 15. Whenever an allied follower comes into play, subtract 1 from this amulet's countdown. Last words, give +1/+1 and Storm to all allied Swordcraft followers. So I was looking at a community aggregated ratings website for all the Rise of Bahamut cards, and this card was the absolute lowest rated card in the entire set. Now don't get me wrong, it's pretty bad, but I still think Manifestation of Faith is significantly worse. If you build your deck around this card and have a bunch of followers that summon tokens with your typical Floral Fencer and Sea Queen Otohime and whatnot, you can pop it in about 4 to 5 turns. But it's difficult to control exactly when it pops. If you start your turn and you only have 1 countdown left on this, then you're not going to be able to give the buffs to your entire board. You're going to give it to 1 follower and that's it. If you can time it right and get it to land at the very last follower after playing Sea Queen Otohime, then it's pretty decent, but ultimately it's very difficult to control when exactly it pops. It's very slow and your opponent will have plenty of time to remove it, so overall score -2. It does seem like a fun card, so I won't be surprised if I see some people trying to use it, but still not very good. Next up, Geno 11 Vanguard, 4 mana 4/3. Rush, enhance 6, gain last words, summon 2 knights. So this is Blitz Lancer +1 with a very minor benefit. The downside is that, as I said earlier, you don't typically want Rush on your 4, 5, and 6 mana followers since you're likely to evolve them anyway, making it a waste. This card doesn't really pay for it in stats, but it does have poor stat distribution for a Rush follower. And the other major downside for both this card and Blitz Lancer is that we're about to look at another card which makes them both worse options. So overall -1. Next up, Sword Whip Maid. 6 mana 5/6. Fanfare, deal 1 damage to all enemy followers if an allied commander is in play. Don't mess with the Maid. A 1 damage AoE at 6 mana isn't really ideal, however. Once you get to like 6+ mana, you're looking for at least 2 damage. This could be an overall 0 if it were just deal 1 damage to all enemy followers, but it's also conditional. And you're not going to play this in Banner Swords, so having a commander on the field is a significant condition, so overall -1. Next, Art of the Ninja, 3 mana spell, deal 4 damage to an enhance 8, then summon a Ninja Master. So back when I reviewed Blitz Lancer, I said that Sword doesn't have very many options for dealing direct damage, so having a 3 mana deal 3 damage isn't the worst thing for a control deck, but this card just makes that irrelevant. So this is going to be your control card option, and the enhanced version is just a bonus if you happen to have this card late in the game and you need to deal 4 damage, and you'll get a minion as well. Overall, +1. Onto the neutrals. Lucius Goblin Slayer, 5 mana 3/4. Fanfare, deal 1 damage to all other followers that cost 2 or more. Deal 2 damage to 1 playpoint followers instead. So some classes have better options for AoE and whatnot, but this is a pretty decent effect for the neutral set. And it does exactly what it says on the tin. It slays goblins. If there are goblins on the field, they will die. Unless they're evolved. But that's beside the point. Overall, +1. Not quite as strong as the other new neutral cards, but still decent. Next, Sector, 2 mana 2/2. Fanfare, gain +2/+2 if an allied neutral follower that costs at least 5 play points is in play. So this is Fighter with a minor benefit that's never going to matter. Fighter used to see play in aggro decks that needed a lot of cheap followers, but nowadays there are enough 2-cost followers that Fighter doesn't even see play in those decks. So even with a minor benefit, Sector is never going to see play. Overall, -1. Next, Angel of the Word, 3 mana 2/2. Fanfare, deal 1 damage to an enemy. This is an okay effect for classes that can't easily deal 1 damage. An Angelic Snipe that leaves a follower on the board. Not great, but not terrible. Overall, 0. And finally, Valkyrie Spear, 2 mana Amulet. Whenever an allied neutral follower comes into play, give it +1/+0. So this is obviously a pretty terrible card in general. Shadowverse does a pretty good job of not having strong neutral followers, so decks are mostly comprised of class cards, meaning in a typical deck this isn't going to buff very much. But this set does seem to be pushing neutral craft a little bit, and this card is clearly designed for that deck. Neutral craft is obviously not going to be a good competitive deck. Your average card value is going to be below that of a competitive deck, and there aren't really any neutral win conditions that can beat class-specific win conditions. But it's something you would play for fun. So overall, -2 in general, but if you're playing a neutral craft deck just for fun, this would be a decent inclusion. It's basically a cheaper banner, so +1 for neutral craft. And that wraps up the entirety of the Rise of Bahamut set. The expansion launches on the 29th, after which I will be doing a pack opening, of course, and following that some videos featuring new decks. I'm most interested in trying out the mid-range Daria deck, so you can probably look forward to that deck being featured first. So until then, I hope you found this entertaining and informative. Share any of your own thoughts and opinions in the comments below. Thank you all for watching, and tune in again next time.